Hello and welcome to On Point. I'm Tracy Mejia. For many years, high school students have been stressing to achieve perfect scores on their ACTs and SATs. But now some U.S. colleges and universities are no longer requiring standardized testing for admissions. The National Center for Fair and Open Testing says roughly 1,800 schools have eliminated the SATs or ACT from their admission requirements. Many students struggle with test taking or can't afford tutoring services to prepare for these tests. Removing these requirements will help give these students a bigger chance to enroll in a school that drops the requirement. Critics say standardized testing intensifies inequities across class and racial lines. Some studies have shown that high school grades may be better at predicting college success than standardized tests. But other experts worry about the unintended consequences. They fear getting rid of the SATs or ACTs would just put more pressure on students to take AP courses and exams, so credits can be submitted in time for college admission decisions. But without the SATs and ACTs, how will colleges and universities determine a requirement for students to be accepted into the schools? Will these developments determine how and which students will be accepted in college? On Point's Gitanjali, Mahapatra has more.
Thank you, Tracy. And joining me today are three guests: Audrey, the Senior Vice President from the Campaign for College Opportunity; David Dufault-Hunter from Csun, he's the Associate Vice President for Enrollment Services; and Osuma, a filmmaker and recent alumnus from Csun. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
We're just going to go ahead and jump right in. David, before the suspension of the SAT and ACT scores as a requirement for college admissions, what went into the decision process for accepting students?
The way that admission works in the CSU system is it's quantitative entirely. So there is a combination of high school GPA, and that high school GPA was really not the entire GPA of the student, but only the courses that fall into the A through G category. These are the college prep courses that are offered at high schools. So that GPA in combination with a student's SAT or ACT score they were combined into what's called an index. And then that index determined whether a student was admitted to, in this case, Csun or not. One of the other pieces that you, I'm sure, are aware, the institutions in the CSU system, some of them are non-impacted. It means that if you meet the system minimum, then you're admitted into any program at that institution. If an institution is impacted, meaning there are more applications than there are spots, then you have to meet a higher index score in order to be admitted into that school, and further potentially meeting a even higher score or index score to get into a major.
So how much of that acceptance was really based on students' SAT scores?
The way that the calculation was done, the majority came from high school GPA, but it's still 30% of the index was attributable to the SAT score. And one of the things, you'll probably ask this in a second, is, when we removed the SAT, ACT component, we were able to admit 88% of our incoming applicants, as opposed to 66% in fall 19 when we were using SAT, ACT scores as part of the index.
Did you see like a significant shift in demographics when you started admitting 88% more?
So the demographics at Csun are one of the things that we are really proud about, is that it's already a very diverse campus, but there are a couple populations that we've struggled to enroll. One of them are African-American students or Black students, and using both the high school GPA and then something called multi-factor admission criteria. These are criteria outside just the GPA. When we use those, we increase the incoming class of African-American students by 10%, which is a healthy percentage given where we were, which was a negative trajectory up until fall 20.
Audrey, your company, Campaign for College Opportunity, their stance is mainly that the SAT and the ACT is a better indicator of like race and wealth and inequality and inequity. compared to people's intelligence. So can you talk a little bit about how that new non-requirement for SAT scores impacts what you guys do now that the admissions rate for underprivileged kids are going up?
I think we're really excited about, the decline in the use of the SAT, ACT at the UC, and hopefully soon the CSU will make this decision permanent. I think you know that last month the CSU trustees heard their first presentation and recommendations from an internal task force that's looking to end the use, quite frankly, for the purpose that we care about at the Campaign for College Opportunity, and that is ensuring that qualified, talented students of color, Black, Latinx, Hmong, Samoan students can find their spot at a CSU campus. Every year, more and more students are completing those A to G requirements in high schools. Our high schools are doubling down on making sure students are prepared and taking that curriculum. But then we know that they, face the challenge of whether or not they're going to get one of those coveted spots at our fantastic university systems. And, eliminating these tests that have been proven to really close down opportunities for students of color because they are racially biased. Doing away with them removes one of the barriers, right? A key barrier, but one of the barriers to admissions. I think we're really excited, as David shared, about the recommendations to the CSU campuses to use, multi-factor admissions criteria, like whether a student is a veteran, whether a student is working in high school while juggling their high school courses, whether a student is low income. Those are the factors that we should be considering in a kind of comprehensive review of whether or not a student will benefit from an education at one of our campuses. I think some of the concern and some of what we're going to be raising with the CSU trustees is how do we ensure that there's consistency across all 23 CSU campuses? We could have one campus like Csun, for example, do a really good job at thinking about low-income students, underrepresented students, but another campus that places a whole lot of weight on just the singular math GPA, or maybe places all the weight on the A to G weight of those courses. That means that a student applying from high school is going to have very different outcomes to a CSU system depending on where they apply. And so I think that if we're talking about equitable opportunity to all 23 CSU campuses, we have to talk about some streamlining and some agreement between the 23 campuses about what will be prioritized, almost a ranking of those multiple factors in admissions.
Yeah. Speaking of the factors and admissions, you mentioned all the poverty, etc., that kind of stuff. And that is something that College Board, when creating the test, did take into account in 2019. They created something called the adversity score. And if you didn't know what the adversity score, it's used to gauge what obstacles students who take the SAT measure. It calculates between 1 and 100. There are students like the neighborhood crime rates, poverty levels, quality of education. But it was abandoned pretty soon after, I think about 3 months in favor of a landscape test. So the entire situation was considered problematic across the media, saying that College Board was just trying to fix flaws in the test rather than the entire standardized system test as a whole. Does Campaign for College Opportunity kind of address that in terms of taking SATs and not?
Address the fact that there was the consideration of an adversity score, or?
Yeah, so you guys are kind of doing the same thing in terms of just taking into account all the things students have to go through. Obviously it's working for you guys, but for College Board it was kind of a controversial topic.
It was a controversial topic because they weren't fundamentally getting rid of the SAT, ACT score. Colleges would still be considering that score, and then maybe considering on top of that, taking that SAT score in the context of this adversity score. First of all, the name adversity score is quite down-putting for a student to say, oh, I got really high on my adversity score. Talk about painting a student in a certain way as somehow less than. So that's one. But the second thing was, again, that it really did not, it was not going to end the use of the test, which is the fundamental problem. And so while I think College Board was trying to figure out a way to save itself, to save the test, the better option is to do away with the test and still consider factors such as low income status, your zip code, your first generation status of whether or not you've been college going or not. Consider those separately and apart, not tied to a standardized test.
All right. In the vein of adversity and stuff, a lot of the criticism for the SAT is the amount of pressure it puts on high schoolers. So we talked to Denise Pinales, a high schooler at John F. Kennedy High, who had this to say about taking the SATs and not having to take the SATs.
It's a bit relieving in the sense of I don't have that much pressure with already trying to figure out which college I want to go to, what career, what everything just involving that, including the SATs.
Luis, from this panel, you are the one who has taken the SAT most recently. Can you tell us a little bit about your own experiences when you took the test? Did you have to take prep courses? How did you do? Can you relate to the pressure she's talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember taking PSAT and the SAT training courses, and then also the ACT training, which I actually didn't end up taking the ACT, even though I was preparing for it. But I remember, I've always considered myself to be an intelligent student in my own ways, I guess. But when it came to my junior and senior year of high school, with the mounting pressure of everything, I began dropping my grades because of all the pressure of wanting to take the tests and doing the, extra training for it. And I've never been good at standardized testing, which I always say, that's how I would refer to it. Like, I'm not good at testing, but it wasn't until very later on, actually, like last year, that I was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder, which, going back in my education and trying to identify how that reflected in my education, I would sit there and try and practice for these tests, and I would start reading paragraphs of text. And one of the ways that my OCD shows itself is that if I misread one word, I have to go back and start reading from the very beginning. And so at its very core, having to read these long passages, and I love reading. It's just like, I love reading at my own pace, and I love reading in ways that feel good for me. But when it comes to that pressure where it's timed and you're doing testing over multiple days, and I always just thought I just wasn't good at testing. But I think the pressure and really not having like a lot of awareness about mental illness didn't give me the confidence needed for me to go into college and look for colleges in a very confident way, because I was like, oh, if I'm not good at standardized testing, maybe I won't be good at this, right? And then my grades for my SAT didn't end up being, very good. And that affected where to go to college, which in and of itself, I feel like coming from the communities that we come from as BIPOC students, we don't need extra things to like make us feel less confident, and at the same time, that's not saying that we're not smart enough. It's just that intelligence comes in a lot of different ways, and it should be more equitable for young students to approach college with as much confidence as possible, and as many equal opportunities as possible. So what she just said is definitely 100% spot on. Like, the pressure just from high school as a whole, and then you add these standardized tests that we all have to go through, it gets to be a lot.
That's beautifully said. So I also talked with Rob Franek, who's the editor-in-chief of the Princeton Review, one of the primary SAT and ACT prep programs. And he had this specific opinion on what exactly would happen to universities once they permanently got rid of SAT requirements. We can listen to that now.
So if we're saying that the SAT and ACT are no more, then, other factors in a college admission application become even more clear and clear in their value. Just to set the record straight, the SAT and ACT for those schools that are still accepting them, and those schools are test optional schools as well, are still a very clear second, right? Always the primary driver is going to be your high school transcript, but of course the rigor of your courses in high school, and then obviously ultimately your GPA. And just for your folks to your listeners to understand how primary and how hefty the high school transcript for any student is in the process. That will become even more of value if the SAT and ACT were truly to go away for all, let's say, test blind schools. But then also your college admission essay, the ability to interview. Now, not every school allows us to interview, but those that do, we should never let those opportunities go unrealized. Your list of extracurricular activities. There needn't be a canon there either. Your list of extracurricular activities should be as unique as you are, not as unique as I am. But those are things that students should need to know. Factoring in the SAT as well doesn't eliminate the value of any of those things. It simply adds to that queue.
So let's talk about a little bit how you felt in high school, the pressure to have a good transcript versus the pressure to have good SAT scores. Do you think, knowing now if you were applying to colleges that you didn't have to worry about the SAT, not only your schools would be better, but your mental health would be better? Your grades would be better, my apologies.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. And to me, what he's saying, or the way I'm interpreting what he's saying, is that the changes need to be a little more fundamental from the base of how we view education, so that it's not such a standardized thing, because we are so diverse in our intelligence. So I think definitely if it wasn't for standardized testing and the pressure that comes from those last 2 years of high school already, I think mental health there would be more space to talk about mental health and ways to approach the upcoming years of college, university, community college, whatever it is, approaching those years in a healthier way and in a more sustainable way for students, right? So that when you start eliminating that grind of standardized testing and ways that are very much add a lot of pressure, then you start opening up. I think it would have opened up a lot of different, different healthier practices to approach my education and learning.
So, David, are you now looking only at transcripts and extracurriculars while you're admitting people for the new year?
Well, at Csun, we don't look at extracurricular. We are specifically looking at the high school GPA and then those multi-factor admission criteria, which Audrey sort of outlined, right? It's first generation status, low income status. Are students going to high schools with high percentages of students receiving free and reduced lunch? And so foster youth, that kind of thing. I do want to say something about what the gentleman said from the Princeton Review. And it really, I think one of the things that happened when institutions started to use the SAT, it hasn't been, it's been a relatively recent addition to college admission, right? For a long time, the UC system, the California system, did not use SAT and ACT scores, but it did, getting into the 60s, it started to use it. And one of the things that happened as institutions started to use these standardized tests is they use it as a measuring stick for their own reputation. And we lost the fundamental reason for education, and that is to build and develop talent as opposed to simply identify talent. And that talent is very narrowly defined, right? So there's a guy, Saul Geiser at the UC system, who does a ton of research. He put out an article in 2015 where he demonstrated, after looking at millions of records of students applying to the UC system, that the number one predictor of a student's SAT score was their race. And that relationship was detrimental, right? Meaning that if you were a Black applicant or a Latinx applicant, your SAT score would be predicted to be lower. Mm-hmm. Why is that? It's because, and he argued, that it's the sociological factors that are in play in high school districts in which you just have fewer resources for students, academic resources and financial resources to access the kind of courses that they need to prepare for these kinds of tests. And the test itself has some predictive value in certain contexts, but we all, in the research around high school GPAs, it's always been the number one predictor of student success. Always. It's always outpaced the SAT score, ACT score. It's been the number one. And so our use of that test has had a huge impact, negative impact on our collective community, right? When we've taken folks out of the college process, it means that we have fewer people ready to take on the jobs that they could take on if they were able to get into a college, be developed as a thinker and as someone who is productive in terms of their academic world. And so it's not just one community that loses, it's the entire community that loses, but we don't see it that way. The last thing I'll say, and Luis, I hear you, because your success as a student is much more reflected in your GPA than it is in a 3-hour high stakes test, right? Because your GPA represents all of your dedication, your resilience, your stick-to-itiveness, right? All of that is reflected in that GPA, and your standardized test is just one small measure in the fact that all of us, myself included, identified our intelligence with that piece of information is tragic, because it doesn't actually reflect all the different kinds of intelligence that you talked about that contribute to success. So I am absolutely delighted that, and I can tell you that the CSU is going to eliminate SAT, ACT as part of our admission practice. We're all gearing up for that. I absolutely agree with you, Audrey, that we have to align all of the different criteria so that they're the same across the system. And we have to figure out how we're going to deal with the capacity of campuses to take on more students. How are we going to do that as a system? Because that's going to be a priority. It has to be a priority for our state.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're going to actually listen to one more clip from Rob Franek. He kind of responds to the idea that the SAT does have a very clouded racial history. In fact, an expert from Boston University's Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center says that it plays a huge part in degrading Black and brown minds, and that they helps exclude their bodies from prestigious schools. So we can listen to his response to that.
We should just remind folks that the SAT has been around for just shy of 100 years, and you're right. And certainly in years past, there have been a question of access and equity for those exams, and some students just not being able to profit from the content that is there, might not be aware of the content that is exposed on those tests. Now, I think many of those questions have been righted over the years, but that said, the SAT and ACT are still unfair exams. They are still exams that test you only on how well you take the SAT or ACT. They are not testing a matter of intelligence. I think AP exams, and certainly a high school transcript, is a much better indicator of that. But I can't deny that the SAT and ACT are still important. They are important for academic admission and for scholarship dollars, entry into honors programs, entry into honors colleges. These things are undeniable. And even though these exams are flawed, now I do think College Board, who creates all SAT and of course all of the 38 AP exams, again in its change that is just announced fairly recently over the last couple of weeks, that they are trying again to right some of those ills of the past, making the test shorter, almost an hour shorter, which testing fatigue is one of the things that we teach as a bedrock in our courses, or any content that we talk about. 3 hours is a long time to sit for a test, and that will change to 2 hours. Now there's some limitations around that, which I'm happy to talk about, but again, there are things that the SAT will continuously evolve, and I think to your point, become much more modern, nimble, and then accessible to students across the board.
So interesting.
Yeah.
I think my initial reaction to that is I'll agree with him on one point, and that is the SAT is a test, and the most that it tells us is how well you've been prepared to take a test. how well you do on test taking strategies. Because, the reason why, part of why Saul Geiser's study on the biggest predictor of how someone does on a test is race, is because it is more affluent people in this country that can afford expensive test prep. The type of test prep that is really focused, again, on test taking strategies, not necessarily digging into content. Well, our communities, I went to, back in the day, I went to Garfield High School in East Los Angeles, and it was me and my friends testing each other, going back through our algebra notes and our history notes and studying, how to, conjugate verbs to different tenses, and just overwhelming ourselves. We had no idea how to study for the test. Our entire class, graduating class of 1,000 students, each had a what we called an SAT prep class from the high school that was 2 hours long. That was it. While students who were going to prep schools, across Los Angeles were paying thousands and thousands of dollars to know how to weed out questions, how to figure out, again, what the answers were, not by digging into content, but on how to take a test. Not only that, what we know about test taking is that more affluent parents were also more likely to advocate for their students to have more time on the test. They were more likely to claim, and they are more likely to claim, that their student has ADD, OCD, that they have a test phobia, all of these different things that they use as tools to get their students to have more time. None of which, I mean, if you talk about mental health as kind of a, taboo thing for, first gen communities of color to talk about, they would never go to a teacher, to a principal, and say, I think my child has a mental illness, or a mental condition that would not allow them to take a test. And so, I just want to make it clear that this is not about competency. Again, this is not about smarts, but part of the big reason why you see white students, more affluent students, doing better on these tests is because they take training to take a test.
Well, that's all the time we have today. Thank you, Audrey, Luis, and David, for joining us. You're watching On Point. We'll be right back.
I'm heading out, man. You want to ride?
No, I got my car, but I actually really need to go to the bathroom.
Dude, are you okay?
I am definitely buzzed.
Yeah.
I think I will take this, and I will take that ride home.
Thank you for watching On Point. You can follow us on social media at Csun On Point. You can hear us on KCSN 88.5 FM on Sunday mornings at 5:30. You can watch us on LA 36 and Santa Clarita Valley Television. For all of us here at On Point, I'm Tracy Mejia.